Welcome to Creating Calm Parenting with Mind, Body, and Spirit. I'm Corinne Cayce, your co-host. I'm an integral leadership coach, a mother of two, and a lifelong student of the Edgar Cayce readings, and I am here with my friend and co-host, Arlene.
Hi, Corinne. Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Arlene Dijamco. I'm an integrative physician, a pediatrician, and a cranial osteopath, and a mom of four. And we have an amazing episode for you today. This is another one of our conversations. It's like you get to be with us and hang with us. And today we thought we would talk about what happens after we pass on, after we leave the physical plane and into what Cayce calls the borderland, or the inter-between state. And so this is when our physical body has left. We've left our physical body. We've died. We've crossed over. So basically, what happens after someone dies? What is this life after death, or something more eternal? And what can the Cayce readings help us understand in this life that keeps going?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to unpack here. And to set the stage, Corinne is going to help us with an opening meditation.
Yes. So as we prepare to kind of open our minds, soften the edges and the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual, and our sense of what is real and the way that consciousness and energy moves, let's sort of set that intention for ourselves as you close your eyes, if that's appropriate, or just let your attention turn inward for a moment. And as you take 3 deep breaths, touch into your awareness of yourself as an energetic body, as layer upon layer of energetic vibratory patterns. All right. Thank you. So, as Arlene said, today we're going to talk about what the Edgar Cayce readings describe as the borderland, or the inter-between. My grandfather, Hewlin Cayce, would give talks on this and describe it as the first 10 minutes after death, or kind of what happens to us as we're transitioning from a physical body to our soul body, moving out of this physical earth plane into a wider consciousness. How do we communicate? Do we communicate? How do we reach our loved ones? How do our loved ones reach us? All of these sort of questions that get mixed up in this place. And to sort of begin, I think it's important to recognize that what Arlene and I are going to be talking about is really, there are not words to really describe it well, that it lives in a place of mystery and sacred meaning and truth for ourselves, for each individual. So we're going to be bringing words that come from the Edgar Cayce readings and our own interpretation of those readings. But to start, and one reading in particular, but to start us off, I'd like to read an excerpt from a letter that Edgar Cayce wrote in his waking state. So this is not from a reading, it's from a letter that he wrote on June 23rd, 1936, to a friend of his. And he says, in respect to your questions, first, yes, the reading and the experiences have convinced me that life is continuous. The spirit and soul lives on. Apparently, there is no set time for the return to earth, some early, some after lapse of many years to us. Apparently, time is an unknown quantity to those in the spirit world, and that fact is often confusing to us here when we receive messages from them, where they are in communication to us. And then second, yes, without doubt, many have communicated with me, that I am sure. I cannot tell or convince others by my own experience, but to me, I am very positive there are hundreds that have talked with me as face-to-face, certainly have been able to identify such persons many, many times. So this is just in very clear language, stating that, Edgar Cayce, in his experience, both waking and in giving readings, had made contact with many souls who had crossed over and were no longer in physical bodies, and that there is a return that's coming back. So, and he also illuminates something that is very important, I think, for us to begin to understand, which is when we're not in a physical body, time loses all meaning. Time as a structure of moving through space and understanding reality is gone. Past, present, and future become one. And the same, I think, can be said for space, physical space, and the way that it works. So we're not going to try and unpack all of that here, but just kind of like having a shared understanding of when we're talking about this kind of thing. What happens when we die? What's happening in the borderland? There's not time and space as we begin to understand consciousness from that perspective.
And in the Cayce readings, he describes these transitions really as transitions in states of consciousness.
Mhm.
And there are many states of consciousness. And in the readings, he also says that all consciousness is one consciousness. But
Right.
for understanding, we can describe different states of consciousness. Even in our human form, we have different states of consciousness. We have
Mhm.
our sensuous consciousness from the physical body. We have our subconscious, those patterns in our mind that are may or may not be readily available to the consciousness. And then we have the super consciousness of spirit, and that's in human physical form. And
Mhm.
then once we cross over, there is a shift in states of consciousness. So we if the transition is complete, then we no longer have that sensuous physical consciousness, and instead we have the subconsciousness becomes that. And he describes the subconsciousness as something that never forgets. And so we are functioning more at that level. These that was um, described as subconscious in our human form, and then we also have the super consciousness of spirit. But then we have more widely available to us that expansion of consciousness, of the cosmic or universal consciousness, which can also be described as being on that astral dimension. So
Mm.
we're much more expansive once we transition from our physical, sensuous consciousness bodies.
Mhm.
And what's curious to me is he says that, well, you can have something in between because sometimes people transition from their physical bodies, but they don't even realize it. So
Mhm.
they maintain some of the sensuous consciousness, like souls that don't even realize for whatever reason of like how they crossed over, or we can think of different reasons why, but that they haven't fully left that earthly dimension, and so have
Mhm.
maintained some of that sensuous consciousness even without their physical body. and
Right.
and that can be for some a short period of time, and for others it could be many years in terms of like human years before a soul realizes it. And this is why in the Cayce readings he says that we can also help souls in the borderland or inter between, because perhaps some of those souls that don't even realize that they've crossed need some assistance. And so we
Mhm.
can help they can help us. Sometimes they can bring hope for us, but sometimes, they need us to bring hope for them, and that's a beautiful connection.
Right, and I think some of what you're pointing to, Arlene, is that the Edgar Cayce readings describe the shift between life and death in one sense as being very subtle. So it feels, like the biggest deal for us when we're alive to die, to no longer be alive. But from a consciousness perspective, it isn't it is subtler and kind of softer, like as the Edgar Cayce readings describe it, as kind of moving from one room to the next, opening one door and moving through it into another space. And that subtleness, it has also been described as a birth into one into another layer of awareness or consciousness. And when the readings say that sometimes it can take years or who knows how long amount of time for a soul to realize that it has crossed over, it's almost, if you can imagine an infant after it's been just born, that there's that it's, if you've been with a baby when it's so newborn, sometimes you can feel it present, and sometimes it feels like it's still in a dreamlike state and it's sleeping a lot. And there's kind of like this sacred, quiet, rocking and resting time as it's becoming more and more embodied into the physical, that there's something similar that's happening on the other side, that's a slow, gentle awakening. And likewise, it's described, that moment of crossing over in the readings, as a gathering, that souls are coming together often to welcome the crossing over into death, in the same way that we'll gather when a baby is born here to welcome it and celebrate it. That there's this, that no matter how sudden it can feel at a physical level, at a deeper super conscious, subconscious soul level, it is always known and anticipated, and not, so that, and then there's a gradual awakening as the soul is ready to move and begin to experience life on the other side in that way. And the readings go on to continue to describe what the soul, what it is that we take with us, and how we can begin to kind of grasp and understand what uh, our experience is like. Our isn't even the right word, because of our sense of ourself is so fundamentally altered. But in order to frame that conversation, Arlene and I were using a series of readings, the 5749 series, that were described as spiritualism, or the spiritualism readings, that were really grounded in some questions that Edgar Cayce's wife Gertrude and Gladys and his son Hulin and some other people had around, how do we talk to people who have already died? What is it that's going on? And we'll be reading from 5749-4 specifically. We found this one to be most substantive. The really interesting thing about this series of readings is that the majority of them, and there's only 16, were given voluntarily at the front or back end of another reading that Edgar Cayce was giving. So he would be giving a reading for a specific person, knowing, as he was going into his hypnotic state, that he would be giving this reading. And then as Gertrude, his wife, would be trying to wake him up, unsolicited in an involuntary way, he would just start speaking and saying something. And it was fascinating to read these readings, whereas often someone who has crossed over sending a message through related to what it's kind of like on the other side, and a message about whatever, something, how to do the work of the A.R.E, or how to, an idea or something to go on. And so these readings were sort of captured and studied around, like, how to communicate, what communication with people who are no longer alive is like. So as and in this reading, it said, many are gathered around now to share their experiences of what it is like on the other side. And I think one thing that Arlene and I wanted to pull forward, that is that this reading, to the best of our understanding, says that what it is that survives are patterns that we've built in our physical bodies. So everything, all the work that we've done, the thoughts that we've had, the actions that we've taken, specifically as they align toward our ideal, or those things that bring meaning and joy and hope and inspiration to us, the ways that we're trying to grow to be better people and live meaningful lives, to love well and deeply, all of the energetic vibratory patterns that we've put toward being alive in that way, becomes the body that we habitate, that we live in once we're no longer in our physical bodies. So uh, let's see, what a direct excerpt from reading 5749-4 on that is, that as builded by the soul is as the residence of that soul. the companion with that as has been builded by that soul, either of the earthbound or of that element or sphere or plane that has had its attraction through that created in that soul, being in the actions by the thoughts of that as an individual. So
Yes.
let's
And
talk about that a
that
little more.
that that was builded by the thoughts, and this is where those subconscious patterns that we build in our lifetime
Mhm.
become the material, in a way, that cosmic material of when we cross over to build our soul bodies.
Right.
So the subconscious becomes our quote physical once we
Yes.
cross over, and
Yes.
it builds it's a soul body, so it's not that 3D physical, but
Mhm.
it is the, relative physical, like, if we're shifting in states of consciousness, so what was our subconscious now is building the what makes our soul body.
Right. And so another question was, where is the dwelling place of such spirit entities? So once you no longer have a physical body, where are you? They were asking. And the answer is that such entity has builded. And as the entity draws about it or desires same shall be. In the earth's plane, many are attracted by those conditions and are held by many loved ones when their desires to be on the way, as it were, builded in that way and manner as is in the heart of hearts, soul of souls to be about. See, now the dwelling place is as builded by that entity, and in that place about the earth and the earth's sphere, time is no time, space no space to such entities. So this is speaking both to like the way that our mind is that unconscious subconscious mind is what we have to work with when we leave. So, there's I heard stories growing up, about if you're fixated on baseball and immersed in sports, then a lot of your experience when you're no longer in a physical body is still going to be paying attention to baseball and sports and focus on all of that. Like you're still working with your mind in the same kind of way. Another Edgar Cayce reading says, like, don't imagine that a Methodist or Episcopalian or a Catholic isn't a Methodist or Episcopalian or a Catholic once they've crossed over. Like you still are that, you're still working with all that you've builded in this lifetime on the other side, and yet there's still this like creative force and oneness and ability to attune and move and grow and evolve as you are ready for it. So what you are attracting to yourself is the direction in which you are going. And I think some of the most powerful stories related to this are, the stories that we hear, or maybe we've experienced ourselves, is when someone is getting ready to die, what as they move between these different states of consciousness, the stories that they tell. And one story that really impacted me was when Gertrude Cayce was dying. She died only 3 months after Edgar Cayce died, and as she was slowly moving in and out of consciousness, she had cancer. She was being, cared for and watched over by women who were in the first study group and very dear friends and very involved in the work. And one evening, she was laying there, sort of in and out of consciousness, and a woman was with her, watching over her, and the woman's name was Lydia Schrader Gray. And as she was sitting with Gertrude, she began to have the real sense that Edgar Cayce was there. And at one point, she turned to Gertrude and took her hand and said, "Gertrude, it feels like Edgar is here and that he wants you to go." And Gertrude turned to her and said, "I know he does, but I need to wait and see about the boys." And both of her sons, Hewlin and Edgar Evans, at that point were away in World War II serving in the military. And she wanted to just check in with them at an energetic level, I think, before she was ready to go. And what I love about that story is the normalcy with which both women were moving across the border in between the seen and the unseen, the recognition that all force is one force and that we're allowed to relate to all these different levels of consciousness and awareness and kind of normalize them. And I think that's the real invitation here with the borderland and the first 10 minutes after death is being willing to put down this idea that there is separation between living and dead in this way and how to be in relationship. And that is another thing that we wanted to talk about, like how do we communicate and how does communication occur?
Uh, yes, in the readings, Casey multiple times uses the metaphor of telephone.
Mhm.
And he says, "Well," because people are wondering, "Can we always communicate like this with loved ones that have crossed over?" And he's like, "Well, yes and no." He's like, "Yes, because just like a telephone is always available, but are the lines of communication clear? Is there static? Is it flowing smoothly?" And he emphasizes both sides must be
Mhm.
ready, and
Mhm.
both sides must have a desire to communicate. So, from our perspective, from a human perspective, being ready is one to have the desire, but also to keep the lines clear. It's helpful to maintain a clear body, a clear
Mhm.
mind,
Mhm.
and to attune with the creative forces. And similar on the other side, uh, what I don't know as much about, like, what would block it from the other side, except for there must be some sort of connection from that side. Do you
Mhm.
have any clues, Corinne?
Yeah, in reading the readings on this, it said when it was talking about, a willingness on both
Uh-huh.
sides and a desire on it kind of generalized and said there are moods on both sides and willingness on both sides. And I would also imagine that like the sense of, like I was saying earlier, time and space and what is possible that you're it that uh, the intention, the strength and focus of the intention and attention is only, like frequencies, only tuned in and dialed in at certain times based on conditions, that may be happening. That's what I can
Mhm,
imagine, and
mhm,
that, like, what patterns are actually available to you, like, what did you really believe and work with when you were in the physical, and how does that impact what you believe and what's possible when you're on the other side?
mhm,
What the readings were also very clear on is that we one way of helping with attunement and helping communication happen is to let down the barriers that we build within our own minds around what communication is supposed to look like or should look like or needs to look like, that there are all different ways of being in communication that are beyond our sort of limited,
mhm,
often assumed ideas of what communication would look like through the senses in all sorts of
mhm,
different ways, and that
mhm,
we can attune in that way too. And that when contact is made, what feels like contact to you is contact. To
mhm,
not to know that it is real and that it is true if it feels that way to you, and
mhm,
that what and that it will be different and is different for every individual and every soul, that there's not a recipe or a formula for what it's supposed to look like or what it will be like or what it even means. And this
yes,
speaks, I think, to what a soul actually is that which what is meaningful to you, what is true to you, what you know, who you know yourself to be, is what is real. And so the work that you do to understand that within yourself is what makes it real. And the blocks that we put up from fear of all different sorts are blocks that we can take down just as easily because of choices that we
mhm,
make within
mhm,
ourselves. So it's not something that happens to you, that descends upon you, as much as something that you create and long for and call forth within yourself through your exertion that creates it.
Yeah. It's clear in the readings that the interpretation of the connection of whatever comes through depends on the individual and that
Yes.
individual's perspectives on both sides. And then also with that, he says that not to force the connection.
Mhm.
And we understand force and pressure from a human perspective, but in one of the readings, it asked, "What is force on the astral
Yes.
dimension in a cosmic way? What do you mean by force?" And he said, "Well, the same thing. What has builded that through the mind, through thoughts
Mhm.
and patterns." So, those which, as you were saying, can also be shifted. But if
Yeah.
we have certain thoughts or patterns, so remember that builds the soul body in
Mhm.
the cosmic dimension, the
Mhm.
subconscious, and so that we can't go against what has been built. We can change it, and then in some readings, there's certain things that are easier to do on those dimensions, and there's actually certain things that are easier to do when we're in physical form and manifestation. Of course, we have our sensory experiences, but there are things that we have the opportunities to do to remember ourselves, to attune ourselves, and we have so much opportunity for growth on the human dimension that we can make huge strides in our soul journey, evolution, and growth in
Mhm.
human form. So we don't have to wait for our inter between life
Mhm.
because there's a lot that we can grow in our human body, even if sometimes we feel limited by our physicality. It's,
Mhm.
part of that is giving us actually more opportunity.
Mm.
It's like room for growth into the infinite, realizing that even in this form, we are these infinite eternal beings.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and at the same time, he says, like, there's so much help that we can get from all of these beings that are around us. And
Yes.
I liked this quote. This is from 254-69 because it was talking about the state of the country. And, it said, "In presenting that which is existent, respecting the work, this is much in the manner as if a shadow were cast over the whole of the present country, viewed from the material viewpoint." And, this could be both a physical shadow of weather, but also like a metaphorical shadow over the country. It goes on, "This is a situation that exists from the purely material or mental earthly angle. While in those realms of thought through the borderland, there is rather the hopefulness, expectancy, determinedness in many, many quarters, and more hopeful helpfulness in many a higher source."
Mm. Mm.
I like that just because it sounds like, okay, there was at that time, I don't have the date offhand for this reading, but that there was a shadow cast over the whole country. And
Mhm.
perhaps we can see some analogies in our present time. And we still have the hopefulness of many, many from a higher source.
Mhm.
And to remember that there is no time, there is no space once we enter the cosmic world. And
Mhm.
we have the help from that cosmic realm
Yes,
in our 3D now.
absolutely. And it seems like, through reading so many of these readings, is that like longing to help is coming from both sides, and
Mhm.
that longing to help, that desire to support and guide and love both what coming toward us as blessings and support and guidance and wisdom, and that which we can offer out toward souls that have crossed over toward, when you're feeling overwhelmed by the amount of suffering and death and wars and conflicts that are happening everywhere. What can I do to help ease that? You know, one, prayer is such a powerful tool, as we've talked about, and often the readings say directly, pray for those who have passed on. And he offered a prayer for those who are in the borderland at the request of the Glad Helpers prayer group in the 281 series. And the prayer is, Father, in thy love, in thy mercy, be thou near those who are in and have recently entered the borderland. May I aid when thou seest that thou canst use me. So being willing to offer yourself, to ask for help and support, and offer help and guidance in those for those who have passed on can be a tool that you can use all the time. And also, an equal tool is being willing to open to the guidance, to the blessings, to the support and love. Like Arlene was saying, the what can feel like the darkest of times here, and there's a shadow over the land, and at the wider cosmic level, what there's actually an abundance of hopefulness and an awareness of change and what is possible that can happen, and energy that's waiting to be channeled down here in the earth to help support that kind of transformation happening, and being willing to kind of open ourselves likewise to that. So uh, that that I think is just an introduction to this idea of the borderland, of the interbetween, of beginning to explore death and what it means, and souls and communication, and this ongoing dialogue that we're having. And certainly this time of year is a great time to be thinking about that. Lots of us naturally are anyway, and having some of those conversations with our children and exploring how we feel, what we believe, and what we know to be true, and what we're open to, and getting curious about it.
Yeah, this has been fascinating, and we are just scratching the surface of this topic, which,
Absolutely.
yeah, has been so amazing.
Yes. Thank you so much, Arlene. Always such a pleasure to explore this. And I know we'll continue having more conversations about this. I want to introduce it and then slowly kind of dig deeper into uh, breaking down the boundaries between our physicality and our soul and spirit selves.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, everyone.